Welcome to 20 Summers and to a day of words in the barn here on a beautiful Saturday morning in Provincetown, Massachusetts. I want to thank the community of Provincetown, especially the library and the Provincetown Bookshop, for supporting our efforts to keep the beautiful, historically significant Hawthorne Barn open to the public for 1 month every spring for conversations, readings, concerts, and all sorts of cultural events. We have an intimate audience this morning. We also want to thank Comcast for televising, broadcasting this event so that audiences can watch it in their own living room. But we also urge everybody out there to make a trek to Provincetown and come to 20 Summers at the Hawthorne Barn. So our first guest this morning on our Day of Words is Cheryl Tan. And Cheryl is the author of A Tiger in the Kitchen, a memoir of food and family, which New York Magazine's Grub Street named one of the top 25 food memoirs of all time. A native of Singapore, she is working on her second book, a novel, and is the editor of the just-released Singapore Noir, an anthology of noir fiction set in Singapore. She has worked as a staff writer covering fashion and culture at the Wall Street Journal, In Style, and the Baltimore Sun. Her writing on travel and food has appeared in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Paris Review, Bon Appetit, and Food and Wine. I want to write for all of them too. She has won major grants from the National Arts Council of Singapore and has been an artist in residence at Yaddo, Hawthornden Castle in Scotland, and the Jurassic Resident Artists Program. She will be taking marriage proposals shortly. No, she lives in Brooklyn, and we are really happy that she came all the way to Provincetown. And Cheryl is going to read a little bit and talk about both her wonderful food memoir and her brand new anthology that she edited, Singapore Noir. But to begin with, Cheryl, you know, I think most Americans have a pretty fixed idea of Singapore as this place that's very, very clean, very, very strict, where if you write a piece of graffiti, you'll be thrown in a dungeon for 10 years and flogged. So maybe you'd like to disabuse us of some of our illusions, or tell us things we don't know about Singapore.
Well, thanks for having me here. First of all, this is a lovely space, and it's so wonderful what you guys are doing. But Singapore, I grew up in Singapore. I left when I was 18, and I moved here for school and never went back. And I've lived here for about 20 years now. And in my 20 years here, whenever I mention Singapore, people always say one of a few things: caning, fines, you know, ban of chewing gum. And it's always sort of frustrated me because Singapore, yes, it's very clean, it's a little strict, there are a lot of rules, but at the same time, you know, it's also a very complex country, and it's a tiny little island. You can drive from one end to the other in 90 minutes, and it's packed with 5 million people. It's on the tip of Malaysia, and it's packed with you know, Malays, Chinese, Indians, Eurasians, Caucasians. So it's a real polyglot that's sort of packed into a very dense space. And when that happens, you have fascinating stories. So that's what I've been trying to do with the books that I've been writing. So far, they've all been set in Singapore. And my first book was really about going home and discovering Singapore from an outsider's perspective a little bit. I had lived here for more than 10 years when I started to really miss the food of home. I had grown up in Singapore not wanting to be a traditional female. And so when my aunties tried to drag me into the kitchen, I would always refuse because I wanted to read, I wanted to write, I wanted to do real things. And it wasn't until much later that I was here and I really missed the food of my home, and I felt very sad that I didn't know how to make any of it. So I spent a year traveling back to Singapore to learn how to cook for my aunties and my grandmother and my mother. And to them, they were very happy because they were finally getting to teach me how to be a woman. So it was sort of this self-discovery process, I guess. So that was a lot of fun. And then out of that book came the second book, because when I was there, I spent a lot of time that year. And I realized that the country had changed a lot, but there were such fascinating pockets everywhere in the country. And I wanted to really sort of bring that to life, the intimate folkways of my people, and share that with the West in a way that, you know, you don't see many books set in Singapore that are published here. So I really wanted to bring that image of Singapore, the real image of Singapore, to the world.
Yeah. So, you know, in fact, since meeting Cheryl and talking about her book, I've encountered a number of very well-traveled people who said, well, you do know that the best food in the world is actually in Singapore. And I'm like, you're kidding.
It's true.
And it's very hard to find it in this country, right?
It's true. It's true. And that's what really made me miss it. In particular,
even in New York.
Yeah, it's true. It's very hard to find Singaporean food, good Singaporean food anywhere. But particularly the food of my family. They come from southern China, a very poor part of southern China. And so the food kind of evolved from there. And you can't really find it anywhere outside of Singapore. So that's primarily what I went home to learn how to cook.
Yeah. Would you like to read an excerpt from Tiger in the Kitchen?
So this excerpt is about my first trip back, and I wasn't quite sure what to expect. At the time, I was a fashion writer at the Wall Street Journal, and I was very used to this fast-paced life, everything happening when it's supposed to happen. I was used to writing about people who don't eat as opposed to people who do eat. And so this was a little bit different. So there's a little bit of culture shock going here. And my late grandmother was an amazing cook, and she made these amazing pineapple tarts around Chinese New Year, which are these buttery, they look like little sunflowers, buttery cookies topped with pineapple jam that she would make herself. And I always thought that I would learn how to make it from her. And but when I was 11, she died, and so I always regretted that I never learned. But one of my aunties cooked with her and had her recipe, so I finally begged her to let me into her kitchen. And so this is from that bit. In silence we worked, my inability to speak much Teochew being a major social hindrance. But as we carefully dug out the 100 or so eyes that were in each pineapple, the stories emerged. Auntie Karim, of course, began by asking the question I've been getting since I became engaged 7 years ago. When are you having a child? My answer that I was just too busy with work, with life in New York, to even fathom producing anything that would depend on me for just about everything was unacceptable, of course. After a short silence, her sisters nudged me to take a break and eat something, gesturing to a large pot of jet black liquid on the counter. "Du ka tio," my Auntie Karim said in Teochew, stopping to explain further in Mandarin when it was clear that I had no comprehension of what she had just said. It turned out the dish was a stew of pig's trotters braised in black vinegar and ginger. "Good for after giving birth," Auntie Karim said. "Very easy to make." Her point was taken. When the 70 pineapples had been cleaned, prepped, and cut into large chunks, Auntie Karim began running the slices through a juicer, dumping the pulp into a massive wok and preserving the juice in a pot. Into the wok went cinnamon sticks, knotted pandan leaves, and a few cups of juice. And then the laborious work began. For the next several hours, we sweated over the stove, stirring the pineapple concoction in several woks, pausing now and then to taste the gradually congealing jam to see if the mixture needed more sugar or juice. Actually, to be more accurate, Auntie Karim sweated over the stove. As she did the bulk of the stirring, with me pitching in now and then, I hovered with my notebook and camera, trying to document every move, believing that this would be the best way to ensure that I would remember every sliver of this process. Watching Auntie Karim stir with ease and calm in her mother's sweltering backyard kitchen, I felt increasingly puzzled. She looked nothing like the frazzled bundle of nerves that I was in my own kitchen, where I often found myself glued to a printed-out recipe or instructions on my BlackBerry. Auntie Karim, however, displayed none of this trepidation. Instead, I watched in shock as she would sample the tiniest spoonful of boiling jam, then cavalierly slit open giant bags of sugar, hoist them over the woks, and give them a hefty jiggle, inspiring landslide amounts to tumble forth. Wait, I said. How much are you putting in? How do you know how much to put in? These questions at first confused Auntie Karim, who immediately started laughing once she figured out what I was asking. "Aya," she said. "不用 measure la," she said. "Just taste, and agak-agak." I didn't know it then, but agak-agak, a Malay phrase that means guess, would be a refrain I would hear over and over during the 2 days of tart making, usually uttered following some laughter on my auntie's part over my attachment to the preposterous notion that cooking should be precise. I wasn't seeing much humor in the kitchen that day, however. I'd been hoping to learn a recipe, one that I would be able to replicate back in New York. I had never done the agak-agak thing in my kitchen. How would I know if I was screwing up? And so I attempted to grill my Auntie Karim. "But really, how much sugar do I put in?" Patiently, she explained, "You see how sweet your pineapple is, Law? Very sweet, then add less. Not so sweet, then add more." This was very unhelpful, I thought. "But how can you tell how sweet your pineapple is? Are pineapples of a certain shade sweeter? Can you tell by their smell? If it's sweet, how much sugar do you add? If it's not so sweet, how much do you add? What is your definition of sweet?" Now it was her turn to look confused for a moment, before erupting once again in laughter. "Ah, yeah," she finally said when she caught her breath. "Just taste, 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 then aga, aga." I was starting to get truly panicked. I had traveled from half a world away to learn to make my Taling Ama's pineapple tarts. But it was starting to look like I would return to New York with vague instructions built on the nebulous foundation of aga, aga. After about the 5th time that we had this exchange, however, Auntie Karim decided to humor me by measuring the sugar she was adding. She had learned to make the tarts and to cook for my grandmother, not by measuring, taking pictures, or writing things down, of course. She had learned from watching, from helping, from cooking along with her. There had never been any need for words or lessons. They simply had a job to do, to put food on the table. And they just rolled up their sleeves and they did it. If something tasted too sweet or too salty one day, they would just add less sugar or salt the next. Cooking wasn't a science. It wasn't meant to be perfect. It was simply a way to feed the people you loved.
Wow, that's wonderful.
So that's the beginning.
I think you should make up T-shirts that say "taste, taste, taste," then "aga, aga."
That's true. That's true. And
People come up to you,
aprons.
What's that? Yeah, aprons.
Yeah.
So can I just ask you, did your aunties know that maybe what you were trying to do was to quantify all this magic that they make in the kitchen and put it down so that Westerners could in their own kitchens make? I mean, did they have mixed feelings about that, or were they proud of you?
No,
or?
they were very confused about the whole process, and I explained everything to them. Because my aunties in Singapore, they're the idea of writing a book is so foreign to them, so they had no idea what I was doing. I would tell them, I'm writing this book, I'm researching, and at the end of the cooking session, they would be like, okay, tell us when you're opening your restaurant in New York. I'm like, I'm not opening a restaurant. So after a while, they got it. But yeah, I know. But they were very gracious. They were wonderful. And I think they really took it as a chance to kind of get to know me and for me to get to know them and for them to teach me culture again. Because I'd become this wayward person, living in Americanized, sort of.
So, and then you came back and went wayward again.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so it didn't work.
As you can see from Singapore Noir.
Yes, right. So let's talk about Singapore Noir and how it came to be, because I should say that Singapore Noir is part of a series. What's the name of the publisher? Akashic.
Yes.
That Akashic does. So they've had Boston Noir, Chicago Noir, where they have a prominent writer. For instance, here in the Boston area, Dennis Lehane, I believe, was the editor of Boston Noir, and went out and I suppose corralled a bunch of buddies. Knowing Dennis Lehane, he probably went out to some pub and got everybody drunk enough to sign a contract.
And Joyce Carol Oates did New Jersey Noir.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Really? So tell me about being approached, pulling together all these writers, and how the project, how it went, and how it came to be this book.
Well, I've loved the Noir series for a while, and so I was at the Miami Book Fair speaking about A Tiger in the Kitchen, and at the author's party, I was introduced to the publisher of Akashic, and I said, I love your series, but there's a hole in it. Where is Singapore Noir? And he said, I don't know any Singaporean writers. And a friend of mine said, well, now you do. So that's literally how it happened. Very serendipitous. But also for me, it was, I always have been frustrated by the squeaky clean image of Singapore, and so I wanted to sort of debunk that a little bit. And Singapore is fascinating. There's so many dark pockets in there. There are so many red light districts. They're almost it's separated like department stores. If you want Vietnamese prostitutes, you go to this neighborhood. You want like older Chinese prostitutes, like here you go. Like younger Malay prostitutes, like it's exactly like that. And the thing about Singapore is we all know these red light districts because they're the best places to eat. So I've been going to these red light districts since I was a child because it's got the best noodles. It's cheap food. Men are always hungry and looking for food. So
food, sex.
Yeah. So there are all these like interesting pockets. Singapore doesn't have very many homicides, but when they've happened, they've been spectacular. One of the famous stories is there's a church right downtown Singapore where a woman murdered her husband, the church cook, and turned him into curry. And so
when was that?
This was in the 80s.
1980s?
Yeah. And she was never convicted. So it worked. Or maybe her curry tasted very good.
Sweeney Todd in Singapore.
Yeah. But also, a lot of and so I wanted to really sort of, tell some of these stories. But also, growing up, I had read all these writers there who were wonderful. And I've admired them a great deal. And they've never made the crossover here. So a lot of the writers in here are Singapore's best writers. And they've never been published in the States. 3 of them have won the Singapore Literature Prize, which is the country's equivalent of the Pulitzer. And so I really wanted to kind of show, like, this is what Singlit is like. I grew up reading it, and no one here really knows it. So this is sort of like a little, amuse-bouche.
And they write in English.
They write in
None of these-
English.
'cause I just want to say, when you were reading that section from Tiger in the Kitchen, you mentioned that your auntie spoke to you in Mandarin.
Yes.
Are you fluent in Mandarin?
Yes, I
as well?
am.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Okay, so but the written language in Singapore is English.
Yes, we're a former British colony, so the first language you learn is English, and then for me, I learned Mandarin in school. But if you're Malay, you learn Malay. And also, we speak a sort of a pidgin English in Singapore. It's called Singlish, and it's really a mix of like English, Chinese, and Malay. Sometimes with Indian words thrown in. Sometimes the sentences don't sound quite right because the sentence structure is maybe Mandarin, but it's English words. Or Malay, like for example, in Malay there's no plural, so you'll just repeat the word twice. So you'll say cat. So sometimes that's how we speak, and it sounds a little odd, but that's just how we speak at home.
So you speak that too?
I do, and it's a much more British inflected English. So when I go back, I'm like I can't, as opposed to I can't. So it's quite different.
So tell us about some of the authors that you brought together here, and maybe you'll read a couple of passages from some of the stories.
Well, these authors are, as I mentioned, several of them are Singapore's best. They're, prolific playwrights. Ovidia Yu, Philip Jeyaratnam is one of the best authors there. Simon Tay, Colin Cheong is another Lit Prize winner there. But also, I had a few sort of Western writers who love Singapore. S.J. Roseanne, the mystery writer, who's very prolific, has a lovely story in here. Lawrence Osborne, whose latest novel is getting a lot of rave reviews everywhere, has a wonderful story in here. He named his prostitute Cheryl. I'm not sure why, but I figured, okay, well, let's just run with that. But yeah, so the stories in here, and they also touch on like various. A lot of the topical things that people have been talking about in Singapore recently, maids in Singapore have been a huge topic recently because of maid abuse or maids killing their employers, that kind of thing. So that surfaces a little bit here. There's a little bit of black magic in here because that's very present in Singapore and, in sort of daily discussions. Just sort of sex scandals. And so you see some of a little bit of that here. And one of my favorite stories is a story by Colin Cheong, who's won the Singapore Literature Prize, and it's about the taxi uncle, which is we call everyone uncle or auntie in Singapore. So when you take a taxi, you call him taxi uncle, and taxi uncles have been sort of in the news recently for various reasons, and so his story is about a taxi uncle. But I want to read this little bit from his story that's fascinating and shows you just how different the culture is there a little bit, because there are things that we sort of take for granted in everyday life. And when you explain it to people here, it's like, that's completely weird. But, in Singapore, that's just what we live with. And so this is a bit where Taxi Uncle is talking about something that he has in his cab. Ahwad had a tiny wooden coffin in his cab, about 4 inches long, carved in a Chinese style with the graceful sweeps and arcs that differentiated it from modern Western caskets. He had it in the glove compartment most of the time, but at night it rode on the dashboard, his silent passenger, the thing that watched his back because so much can go wrong at night. The thing that watched his back, and any passenger who understood would be fairly warned. Those who understood would know that in that little scaled-down coffin was the bone of a dead child. Somewhat difficult to come by now because of cremation, but more common in the days of burials and when child mortality was still high. That bone in its coffin kept the child's spirit with the owner. Both were bound to each other. Both were master and servant. Ahwad had inherited the coffin from his father, and so now the child spirit that once followed his father followed him to do his bidding, on the condition that Ahwad took care of it. Ahwad sometimes made a show of it in the way that Christians sometimes like to say grace loudly in public. When he ate, he would order 2 meals or 2 cups of coffee. He would pay for both, but only consume one. Those who did not understand would simply think he had been stood up, probably by an inconsiderate child or an unfaithful mainland Chinese girlfriend, only interested in him as a meal ticket or for his Central Provident Fund savings. Those who understood knew he was feeding his child spirit, and the waiters who knew would keep their distance from the apparently uneaten meal, to clear it later only when it was safe. And that was why Ahwa never let a fare sit in the front passenger seat. It was already occupied.
Wow. That's weird.
Yeah.
And you had a couple other things marked there. Do you want to read from your own story, or do you want to read from another story entirely? Cheryl has a seriously creepy story. I've always liked her a lot, but I read it and I thought,
the dark side.
I better be good when I'm around you.
Yeah.
It's got some very diabolical girls in it. That's why.
Well, you get to have a little fun, right? Imagining what you could be doing. But there's several fascinating characters in here. One of my favorite characters is this guy in the back. I'm not going to read from it, but this writer wrote about a feng shui detective, which is another thing that actually does happen in Singapore, where if you've had a murder or something really terrible happen, a feng shui guy comes in to cleanse the space. And so this guy is a feng shui guy, but he ends up being sort of a detective, because while he's cleansing the space, he goes, wait, that's not quite right. And so the character is fascinating. It's the last story of the book, and it's I love it. It's fast paced. It's hilarious.
What's the title of that story?
It's called Murder on Orchard Road, which is like the Fifth Avenue of Singapore.
I see Feng Shui Detective as a great TV series.
Yeah, I know.
And
And it's a hilarious story. It's the characters in here are so dear to my heart because they're so wacky in some way. And I think that when people read this, they're going to go, this is not quite the Singapore I envisioned. So I hope that's the case anyway. Mm-hmm. But also the thing I love is they're all separate. They're all set in different neighborhoods in Singapore. So a lot of people who go to Singapore, they'll go to the financial district, or they'll go to the shopping district, or they'll go to the red light district. But here you have them really all over the country. There's one that's set on the border of Malaysia, and they're just all over.
Was that something that you made sure would happen, or is that just a happenstance?
Yeah, I was hoping it would happen, and it really shook out that way. So I'm happy because I didn't want to dictate. I said, you just get to reserve a neighborhood, and that's yours. So everyone reserved a different neighborhood, which was nice. And for me, I grew up on the East Coast, which is still a very sort of rural part of Singapore. Singapore is very modern. Like if you look at the cover of the U.S. book, it's got this modern skyscraper, and it's one of the tiger economies of Asia. And there's incredible wealth there. One of the Facebook founders recently became Singaporean and lives there now and spends huge amounts of money, thousands of dollars on drinks every night. And there's the country now has a bar that serves a $26,000 cocktail.
What's it made of?
There's a diamond in it.
Would you take the diamond home?
I guess, or you could eat it, I guess, but. But so it's a fascinating country that's very modern, but I grew up in a very rural part, and it's still sort of very old Singapore in a way, and it's a place that's very dear to my heart. And it's called Changi, and it's an old fishing village, and in Singapore there are these things that we call kelongs, and they're sort of these old fisheries on stilts. And they're in the middle of the water. They're gradually disappearing. And basically, you have a few guys living there all year round, and they just basically catch fish to serve them to restaurants. And it's just sort of very quiet life that's very different from the rest of Singapore. And so that's where I set my story. Aming knew how it would end even before they appeared. The Nibong poles would have long been in place, a wooden labyrinth designed to attract and confuse. He imagined their hearts racing, surges of blood pumping through, adrenaline pulling them further into the buttery blackness, panic steering them along the rows of columns. They would sense then that it was too late. Even so, there was nothing left to do but swim, just keep swimming. It carried reassurance, even if false. By the time the nets closed in, snuggling them together in a tight, slippery ball, there was no more point in trying. This was stupid daydreaming, Aming's mom would say. Fish so stupid, where got brains to think? The woman had a point. And the truth of that was what kept the family in business. Not good business, mind you. Fish farming was becoming far more practical and lucrative than kelong fishing these days. But to start a new fish farm, expensive lah. Maybe when Along came back from Queensland with his atas business degree, then they could discuss it. For now, though, with the kelong that Kong Kong had set up years ago, the family managed to catch enough each month to pass the time. Not good, not bad, just can lah. Just can. That's what Aming's days were, one flowing into the next. His only relief came one Sunday. Aming was squatting on the jetty after a late breakfast smoking a cigarette, trying to see how long he could pull on it, how long he could get the ash to last before it fell off in one long tube. He was getting better at it, almost reaching 1.5 centimeters now, which made him feel a bit proud, even if no one noticed or cared. Life on the Keelung is just like that, he had learned in a year. If you don't notice the small things, there's nothing to notice at all. Monsoon season had just started, which was both okay and not so okay for fishing. Sometimes the stormy waters pushed flotillas of tiger groupers and cobia into the Keelung traps. But some days, all he and Siva hauled in were nets of shrimp and tiny crabs. No matter how many of those you caught, no point, la. The Chinese restaurants only paid big bucks for large fish. Nice ones that they can display in fish tanks. Ma had just scolded him for squatting and smoking like a Samsung the week before, when she suddenly showed up again in her new second-hand Corolla to spy on him. It was true that Aming never used to do it until he started copying his army mates. But once she scolded him, ayo, he found himself doing it all the time. He couldn't understand his mother sometimes. She always said she came by without calling first because she happened to be in the neighborhood. But hello, Aming was her son. Wouldn't he know that she lived in Faber Crescent, all the way on the other side of the island? Sometimes Aming couldn't believe how good she thought he was. He wasn't smart like Alongla, can go to university in Australia and all, but she should at least know that he wasn't stupid. After last week, Aming started really enjoying squatting on the jetty smoking. He liked imagining the look on his mom's face if she pulled up in her Corolla at that exact moment. The thought of that made each puff all the more shock. Spotting the girls made him get up, though. There were two, one big, one smaller, skinny beanpoles with long, pale legs. The big one had a long, tidy ponytail. The little one of those Japanese doll haircuts. Even before they got close, Aming could see how pretty they were. He could tell that they were sisters. Same button nose, same slightly crooked smile, same cheeks the color of young dragon fruit. They even walked the same, each turning out her feet just slightly. Watching them stroll down the pier towards the jetty, slender legs purposely pushing out from their matching black Adidas shorts, Aming imagined them as birds. Were birds as stupid as fish? They must have come from the village hawker center. Each clutched a clear plastic bag of sugarcane juice jabbed with a neon pink straw. From their slippers, Aming guessed that they had lived close enough to walk. He tried to recall if he had seen them before. He didn't think so. Girls weren't that common on this jetty, so he was sure he would have noticed. A little farther away, yes, near the government holiday chalets on Strawberry Hill. Sometimes at night, you might see the Malay ladyboys pop up and loiter a little, some of them looking for a break from walking, some just looking for a good spot for their clients. But mostly, all you saw on this jetty were the morning fishermen and the few Keelung oldies left, and Aming.
Very nice.
Thanks.
Thank you. Well, one of the things that I really loved about that story, I love the voice of this story, this naive but arrogant punk, and something rather unfortunate happens to him in this story. But the way in which you mixed English with kind of vernacular or slang there was very fluid and didn't require any kind of footnotes. And
I'm glad.
I really felt immersed in a completely different place and culture. Now, I know that you're just completing a novel.
Yes.
Do you want to give us a little teaser about the novel? Is there a title yet?
Yeah.
Or just...
Well, my year in Singapore, where I really got to researching tiger, was when I really got to know the country. And Singapore Noir sort of came out of that. And the novel really came out of that. And the novel is called Sarong Party Girls. And it's about a type of woman who exists in Singapore. And the term Sarong Party Girls refers to women in Singapore whose main goal in life is to meet and marry a white man. And because it's a status symbol, and in Singapore, if you're not smart enough to have a career, to have a good career, this is sort of your ticket to a better life. And it's when I was home, I was really getting to know this world a little bit because a lot of my friends, had become SPGs, as we call them, and they would refer to sort of the ultimate prize of Chanel babies. Because if you had a half Caucasian, half Asian baby, it's the Chanel of babies. So the term itself is actually, it dates back to colonial times because the British soldiers soldiers would bring, would have these parties, and they would bring local girls in to entertain the troops. And the girls would come wearing sarongs, and then they might come off. So they were called sarong party girls. So, so everywhere in Singapore now, and that's actually really blossomed in recent years, you have these pockets of like SPG bars and neighborhoods, because that's where women go to meet, you know, a foreign man who's the possible ticket out of this life. And, you know, foreign men come to meet local women. So it's set in that world.
Wow. But the term Chanel baby, I mean, that's from Coco Chanel, right?
Yes, yes. Singapore is very materialistic. So,
okay.
Yeah. So,
do they get those sort of double C monograms kind of tattooed on?
Yeah, they're tattooed on the baby now.
Okay. Chanel babies. That's a great
yeah,
term.
yeah. So I'm very excited to share that. I just finished revisions on that, so I'm hoping to share that with the world too.
Yeah, actually, Cheryl just went to an amazing castle in Scotland to finish that. And one thing that writers love to share are the various places that they've managed to sort of hoodwink themselves into so they can go and be treated like royalty for a short time and work on their books before returning to their
real lives.
Dungeons.
Right,
and,
right.
And
I've actually always found it very useful to write these books about Singapore as far away from Singapore as possible. So I'm in the Scottish castle, you know, writing about Singapore, and I like to write. I like to feel like I'm in Singapore even if I'm not. So I'm like wandering around this like drafty like Scottish castle in March, and I'm wearing like
probably
flip-flops.
underdressed.
Yeah, I was wearing flip-flops and shorts, and people are like, "Are you crazy?" I'm like, "This is the method." Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I would love it if our audience might have some questions for Cheryl. Can we, if we have a mic, we're going to pass around, so speak into the mic.
That's very interesting what you said about sarong party girls, because the first thing that came to my mind when you were describing going back to see your aunties is that you obviously didn't follow the path that I assume most women did of your generation, and I was just curious, maybe that's not true. Maybe a lot of people of your age rejected that traditional life. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about, were you part of a generational move against away from the traditional life? And if you weren't, if you were an individual, how did you get there? Was it reading books? What was it, an influence that determined your path?
Well, I think my grandmother's generation was very traditional. And then my mother's generation broke away from it a little bit. My mother was very wild as a teenager. And she is actually not as good a cook as other people, because she also rejected that a little bit, but she's better now. But then I really rejected it. And people never understood that. My mother would always, and the book is called A Tiger in the Kitchen because I was born in the year of the tiger. And my mother would always tell me as a child, because I rejected everything they wanted to teach me. And she said, "Oh, this is what happens when you have a tiger girl. You know, tiger boys are good, but tiger girls are terrible because you're ferocious. Like, you know, you're ambitious, you're aggressive, you're all these things that girls aren't supposed to be." So I think I was allowed to be a little bit rebellious because of that. They're like, "Oh, well, tiger girls. That's all it is." But for me, a huge influence was my dad. My dad is a very traditional man. He's the firstborn son of the firstborn son of the firstborn son. And he didn't have any sons. So I am his firstborn. So he raised me as his son, essentially. You know, we watched soccer together. You know, he always, you know, encouraged me to read, to be good at math, to never be afraid to like be out there. And he never told me that I had to learn how to cook. So I really took my cues from that and went, okay, well, you know, as my agent told me once, she's like, "You're essentially a boy in a skirt." So that's sort of it, I guess.
So the pushback you got was from your mother, not your father.
Yeah.
There's no shame for a father having a daughter who essentially grows up to be a son of sorts, who goes off into the world and.
Yeah, that's true. At some point, I remember in my mid-20s, the women in my family got very concerned that I wasn't, you know, female enough, and you know, I didn't know how to cook. I didn't know how to. I'm very messy. So you know, so going back for this book, for A Tiger in the Kitchen, was really sort of a part of, you know, getting to know them on their own terms, being in their kitchens for the first time, and for them to get to know me, and sort of resolving my. Modern female personality with, you know, a traditional personality, but having a little bit of both.
Fascinating.
I'm excited to read your book because I love Singaporean cooking.
Oh.
It's
Oh.
amazing, amazing.
Where have you had it?
In Singapore.
Oh, okay.
Our daughter was there for 3 years in the Tish
Oh.
Asia program.
Oh,
And,
okay.
Yeah,
Oh.
and so we got treated very deliciously.
Well, if you go back, I'll tell you where to eat.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and
absolutely.
there are 10 recipes in the back here.
I'm so excited. Yes,
yeah.
that's great. I'm very curious about the cultural changes, so that when you went back and then you came back to this country, I mean, sort of that bicultural living and how it actually inspired you to go back. But how about when you re-entered the U.S. and New York and to that life? What has that change been for you?
I think, I actually found in my year of learning how to cook there, I became much more confident in the kitchen, and I I learned to slow my life down a little bit, because one of the big lessons I learned from my aunties is that you can't hurry things. It's going to take 90 minutes to steam. You can't rush it any longer. And so that was a big thing I learned. New York's so fast-paced. I was going a little bit crazy. So sort of going back taught me how to be a little bit more zen about things, and I brought that back to New York with me. So that was very nice, and I think about that a lot sometimes, that, I don't always have to be, go, go, go. Sometimes it's good to just kind of sit.
Do you see yourself now as fully American? Do you ever have fantasies of spending a significant amount of time living back in Singapore again, or?
Well, I'd love to, be able to split the two and spend a few months there, a few months here. But I do. It's funny. Some of my friends here think I'm quite Asian, and then my friends there think I'm completely American. So it's all about perspective where you are.
Right.
But I'm probably much more broad-minded and liberal than most in Singapore. So I find when I go back sometimes, I'm challenging people. But I think that's good to have a different voice pushing things.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. I think we'll take a little break, and there are books for sale, Cheryl's books of other authors who are going to be appearing today. And when we come back, we'll have 3 other guests. Thank you so much, Cheryl.
Thank you for having me.